My name is Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez, and I work in the Department of Special Collections and University Archives here at Stanford, but I'm also an educator and teach ethnic studies in the San Jose Unified School District, a new course that's being offered. And pretty soon will be actually a mandatory course that students have to take to graduate from high school, and also part of the CSU and UC system. I want to acknowledge a few people before we get started. Karen Biestman is here with us today. She was responsible for organizing this panel, putting in a lot of hours. I also want to acknowledge the head curator, archivist, special collections director who has provided countless hours of support over the years and over the decades with our research, and that is Mr. Roberto Trujillo with us today from Stanford University also. Welcome to this community panel on bringing community history and ethnic studies to the K-14 classroom. We're going to have three speakers talk about the different topics: Native American studies, Native American history, Asian American studies, and we will also be discussing cross-ethnic studies disciplinary issues, and a final talk on Mexican and Mexican American labor. Our first speaker is Taylor Pennewell. Taylor Pennewell is the founder and executive director of Rebound Resource Group. Redbud, excuse me. A Native-led organization focused on improving public health and education outcomes for Native communities. Taylor is a member of the Maidu Indians of Berry Creek Rancheria in Oroville, California. She has an MA in teaching and served as a middle school teacher before founding Redbud. Her work with Redbud has led to a partnership with the National Museum of the American Indian, the California Indian Museum, and the Cultural Center, Save California Salmon, and a number of tribal nations and organizations across the state of California. Please join me in welcoming Taylor.
So I was speaking with Chairman Val Lopez over brunch this morning, and he's somebody who's kind of like a mini celebrity in my world. He's an elder that I respect greatly. I've been watching his work for the last decade or so of my adult life, and I just want to say, thanks to him for coming here, and thanks for all the other Native community members and leaders who are here representing our community today. It's awesome. I will also say that in my conversation with Chairman Lopez, he told me a story about when he was young and he attended his first conference, and he came with this really, really strict presentation that he wanted to follow, and he practiced it a bunch of times and he didn't want to mess up. And that one of his elders came up to him before the presentation and was like, "What is that? You need to rip that thing up, because our people speak from the heart. We channel our ancestors, we channel our communities when we speak. And when we do that, it connects with the audience better. Our point is made better." And so that's what I'm going to try to do with you today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm also going to share some of the resources that we have on our website so that you leave here today with a really concrete idea of what we do as an organization, and also some concrete tools for integrating Native voices authentically into the K-12 setting. So my name is Taylor Pennewell. I am Time Maidu, or Bald Rock Maidu, people of the Ridge, in Berry Creek, California, which is located in Butte County, California. We are a gold rush tribe because our tribe is in the motherlode of the gold rush. So much of our history with settlement, post-settlement history, is impacted by the gold rush. Our ecosystems have been destroyed by the gold rush. Our relationships with our rivers have been severed because of what happened during that colonial contact in the late 19th century in our people's history. The mission of our organization is to eradicate public health and education disparities for Native American youth. And we do this in a couple ways. I served as a middle school teacher at Gateway Middle School in San Francisco for 7 years. And so my expertise is curriculum writing. And so I write curriculum for the K through 12 setting for ethnic studies teachers, but also for science teachers, because I know that much of our indigenous knowledge, all of our indigenous knowledge is scientific knowledge. It's also spiritual knowledge. It's also artistic knowledge. It's everything, because you can't separate, you can't compartmentalize indigenous knowledge into academic subjects. It is all connected. And so that's one thing that we do. We also create curriculum that is designed for the conservation and environmental science and advocacy sector, because we want to make sure that that sector is also educated on the history of the land, the water, and the indigenous people where they operate. We want to make sure that they are integrating Native voices, contacting Native governments before they do anything. Because for our entire post-contact history, we have had people advocating for our land, for our water, who we consider our relatives, without our input. And hopefully, many of you as educated people who are living in a world where we are looking down the barrel of a gun that is climate change, recognize that we have not stewarded the land correctly for the last 170 years. And we are dealing with the consequences. Our children are going to deal with the consequences. Our grandchildren are going to deal with the consequences. And so we're at a moment of history now where it is absolutely necessary that Native people are involved in conversations, are leading advocacy work in every single sector. At Redbud, we start with education, mostly because it's what I know. It's easier for me. But we believe that that education bleeds out of the K through 12 setting into every single sector, whether it's politics, law, public health, et cetera. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we came to start Redbud. And I'll also mention Redbud, and natives in the room will know this, is a sacred plant to our California people, especially to our basket weavers. It's a basket tree plant. And it was my grandmother's plant of choice, and my great-grandmother, and my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother's plant of choice for weaving baskets. And again, for the Native people in the room, baskets are very important to our communities. They symbolize our close relationship with our water and our land, right? Because we take care of those plants, and we pass down care of those plants from generation to generation. Making a basket takes thousands of hours sometimes, lifetime sometimes, to make a basket, because you're taking care of that plant from the time it's a little plant, right? And then you're burning it every year to make sure the shoots are nice and straight and thin, and then you're processing it, and then you start weaving the plant into baskets. And so the basket ends up being a symbol of generations of love and relationship to a specific place that your family is tied to. And so our name Redbud is just a reminder of that relationship that we have to land. So our story, I worked as a middle school teacher for 7 years. And I always knew that one day I was going to leave education and I was going to serve my Native community, and I was going to advocate for my Native community. And I was in a meeting with my boss, one of my bosses, and she asked me, what are your long-term career goals? Like, what do you want to do with your career? You're going to be a lifetime teacher. What are you going to do? And I said that no, I'm eventually going to go leave and I'm going to do stuff for my community. And I really believe that Native kids are not being served in the education system, and that we really need we need new curriculum, we need an overhaul, right, that's going to reflect Indigenous values and Indigenous needs. And she said, that is really, really great, Taylor, super, super noble, but we don't have any Native kids in this school, and we don't really have any Native kids in this district. And I was like, well, I grew up in this district, I went through this district. And I can go back to my classroom right now and I can tell you 5 kids that are tribal members of Great Rancheria Pomo Indians. And so there are Native kids in the class. And the problem is that you do not see them. You fundamentally do not recognize that they exist. And it's not malicious, probably, right? But that's the fact. And so also the fact that those kids are coming into a campus every single day being taught by people that do not know that they exist. They think that we are all dead, right? And the problem is that that was also my grandma's experience when she went to school in San Francisco. And so it's a multi-generational issue that we're dealing with. And so I told her that, and then I went home and I called my cousin who was working at the NIH, and she was also getting her public health master's degree at Harvard. And I said, Madison, like, this is ridiculous. You know, our people in power don't even know that our kids exist, and we have a 25% suicide rate in the Native youth community right now. We can't fix that unless people recognize our existence, right? And so Maddie, my cousin, said, yeah, I had the same thing happen to me at Harvard. In fact, last month, I turned in a paper for my public health degree, and I designed a public health intervention to address maternal mortality rates of the Native community in the Boston area, and I got it back, and I got an F. And my professor said that the population is not statistically relevant enough for this intervention to be useful. And that was in 2020. In a school, Harvard, when, by the way, who's a part of their mission, part of their existence and purpose as a school is to educate Native American college students. It is in their founding documents. So we realize this is a pervasive issue, right? It expands fields. And what happens, you know this because most people in this room probably went to college, have an advanced degree, are in a position of power and influence. And so what happens then when you have an entire community of people in the world's leading institutions that fundamentally don't know that you exist and that don't think that your population is big enough to necessitate support? It means that the public health issues that are life-threatening to our communities continue. It means that we don't get philanthropic funding, right, to support our communities. It means that archivists maybe are not working in partnership with our communities to make sure that our history is protected, right? With the needs and desires of our community in mind. And so all of this happened, and this is a long story, but this is kind of how we do things, storytelling. While this happened, my grandmother was diagnosed with brain cancer, and she had 3 months to live. And she was my connection to culture, right? She is my connection to family. And so, in that moment when she was diagnosed, I knew that this was the baton being passed, right? In that moment, there was no question that this was the right time for me to exit the classroom and invest all that education, all of that learning I got in the classroom from my mentors and teachers and elders into creating the intervention myself. Because the reality is that usually the people in power are not going to create that intervention for you. And this is something that the Native community knows. We create the best interventions for our people. The problem is that when the people in power don't know that we exist, we're operating at a deficit, right? We don't have a lot of resources. And we really need people like you, allies, to get on board and support us. And so that's the long story. And so we started Redbud. My cousin's working on public health research, and she's designing interventions to train doctors to provide culturally competent care to Native communities in IHS settings, Indian healthcare settings. I'm working on curriculum. We have a program called Going Beyond Land Acknowledgements. That's a curriculum for environmental sectors to make sure that our people are involved in that advocacy at every step of the way in the right way. And we are really focused on strengthening Indigenous sovereignty. Because Native identity and Native existence is not just a cute cultural existence. It's not just arts and crafts, right? It is a political identity as well. And it is an ancient political identity. It has always been here. It's an economic identity. Our economies have always been here. And that is often missing, I notice, from the classroom and from the consciousness of the public. We're usually just kind of siphoned into dancers, right? Or or crafts people. And that's just simply a gross and inaccurate oversimplification of who we are and our strengths. So I want to take a moment to just point out some of the early curriculums that we have created. And these are just a sampling of some of the stuff that we have that can be implemented in a classroom setting tomorrow. We are also working with the National Museum of American Indian, the Smithsonian, to roll out their California genocide curriculum. It is a document-based question, DBQ lesson, all about California genocide. They also have a mission curriculum that we're helping to support. In addition, we are working with the Marin County Office of Ed in the state of California to write a California genocide curriculum that will be a part of a genocide studies scope and sequence for the K through 12 setting. So there's much more coming down the pipeline, but as you know, curriculum takes a really long time to make. I certainly know that as a teacher. So here's our website. If you go to educational resources, hopefully it loads quickly. We have some curriculums here. Sorry, it's loading a little funny on this screen, but we have right here Ethnic Studies Support Unit, and the unit is centered around the essential question of what is the impact of erasure on communities? And it's something that I think that is being addressed in this conference, so I think it's very relevant. And who should tell our stories and why? And so this really inspires students, whether they're Native or not Native, to reflect on how they see themselves and their multifaceted identities in the public sphere. And if they're not seeing themselves, how does that impact them psychologically, in their health, right, holistically? And then how can they be empowered to tell their stories in a more authentic way? We have a curriculum that we created in partnership with California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, called Healthy Ecosystems Feed Healthy Communities. And this has students looking at the question of how is my physical health related to the health of my environment, and from a Native perspective. And so it integrates science, having students look at how to create a healthy oak woodlands ecosystem using traditional ecological knowledge practices. And it integrates poetry and storytelling as well from the local Native community, the Pomo community specifically. We also have a preschool curriculum called Acorns All Around Us that I really like because it integrates Maidu language, integrates my language, and it teaches kids about the Maidu plants and animals in the Oak Woodlands ecosystem as well, and gets them excited about being in relationship with those plants in a better way. And I will say that when I train adults, I start with acorns all around us because that's often where we are as adults, myself included. Like, if you leveled my Maidu, I would definitely be at like a 2-year-old level. So we also have a little book. It's a guide called Seeing Our Native Students that we wrote that provides very basic definitions, some historical context about the Native American experience, political experience, I should say. And it's an attempt to provide teachers with like that basic elementary information that you really should know as a person in power of influence before you even start to teach Native studies. Because I know a concern in our Native community is that there aren't a lot of people who are qualified to represent us, but teachers are often put in the position where they have to, right? And I know as a teacher, it is very, very uncomfortable to have to teach about other people that are not your people and that you don't really know about other than what the textbook says, right? And so we attempt to provide that for you. We also have a animated video guide that goes into greater depth into all those concepts and topics. These are all for free on our website. It's very grassroots. We do everything via grants, via partnerships with tribal communities and community centers, and small philanthropic donations. But it really is a labor of love. It's a labor of grief. I don't have an option not to do this. It is something that I have to do. And it's something that everyone on our staff has to do. So on that note, I think that I'm gonna end it there. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope that some of these resources can be useful for you in the future. My advice to anybody who is unfamiliar with the Native community is to seek out, well, first of all, to remember that we are living among you. You work with Native people, they're in this room. You teach Native people, you are learning from Native people. And to never forget that, when you enter into a public space, please always ask yourself, where are the Native communities represented here? Where are the local Native communities represented here? If they are not here, why have they not been contacted? Ask that. Ask that all the time, because we really need help in making sure that the public knows that we exist before we can even move forward with the processing of the information and the trauma and the grief and creating a future together, also moving forward. So thank you very much for having me. Please stay in touch.
Our next speaker is Dr. Gary Mukai. Dr. Mukai is the director of the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education, SPICE. SPICE focuses its work in 3 areas of curriculum development for elementary and secondary schools, teacher professional development, and distance learning education. Dr. Mukai is a graduate of UC Berkeley and Stanford University. He is the recipient of the Graduate School of Education and Alumni Excellence Education Award in 2017, and the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Rays Government of Japan 2017. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Mukai.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ornelas, and also Karen. Thank you for organizing this panel. It's really an honor for me to share this panel with Taylor. It's nice to meet you today, and thank you all for coming. So I'd like to first give you a brief overview of SPICE, the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education. And then I'll introduce you to some examples of SPICE's work that focuses on history in community. So the topic of my talk is bridging Stanford University and K-12 schools. Recently, we've been doing more work with community colleges as well, with a program with Stanford Global Studies. So first, a few words about SPICE. We are a program of the Freeman Spokane Institute for International Studies here. And a few words about its history. SPICE actually dates back to 1973 with a program on China. In 1972, President Richard Nixon visited China. And in 1973, scholars at Stanford made a decision to help local teachers upgrade the teaching about China. Because a lot of what was taught was incorrect. Even information in the textbook was very biased. And so the program on China focused primarily on 2 areas, which we still continue today. So the development of curricular materials on China, including materials on U.S.-China relations, and also the Chinese-American experience. One of the early units that SPICE developed focused on San Francisco's Chinatown. And the second area worked directly with teachers, teacher professional development. So those are the 2 areas that are the origins of SPICE, dating back to this program on China in 1973. By 1976, a project on on Japan was added, and a project on Latin America, and a project on Africa. And the name SPICE was developed then as sort of the umbrella term for these 4 programs. Over the years, SPICE has included various projects, regional as well as country-focused projects, including a project at one point on the Soviet Union. SPICE serves as a bridge between FSI, or the Freeman Spokane Institute for International Studies, and Stanford broadly and schools, primarily elementary, secondary schools, as well as community colleges. We still continue to develop curriculum, continue to conduct teacher professional development. And about 20 years ago, we launched our first online class, which we offer directly to high school students nationally. that class focused on Japan and US-Japan relations. Since then, we've added courses on China and Korea. And I've been trying really hard to raise money for a course on Mexico. But it's tough. One of my main jobs is to raise money. And my hair used to be black at one point when I started 34 years ago. But part of this is genetics, I think, but a lot of it has to do with raising money to sustain these programs. And we also do some educational research. So that's what we do at SPICE. Now, in preparation for this session, I referred to California's Department of Education's Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum on Asian, American, and Pacific Islander studies. And I'm sure most of you know that the suggested topics include identity, migration and immigration, exclusion, resettlement, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and colonialism in the Pacific. So I'd like now to introduce some lessons that we've developed at SPICE on these topics. And we suggest these to teachers as supplementary curriculum. And we hope that they use some of these to supplement what's in the standard U.S. history textbooks. And, while sharing, I'd like to give a few examples of how the history of my family intersects with that of Native Americans and Mexican Americans, to touch upon topics that were shared by Taylor and will be shared by Ignacio. So, first, all of you know about the Chinese laborers and the gold mines. I'd like to mention a very comprehensive curriculum unit that we developed on Chinese railroad workers. And in this unit, we draw upon and engage students with a lot of primary sources, including photographs from Department of Special Collections, well represented here today. So we engage students in the analysis of visuals such as this. And these curricular lessons that we developed was basically our attempt to bridge Stanford University scholarship and schools. How could we make this scholarship accessible to younger people, right? Because there was a major project at Stanford called the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America Project. And we worked with Professor Gordon Chang and Dr. Roland Siu. And one of the things that we continue to do, as I mentioned, is conduct teacher professional development seminars. This was during the pandemic, and we decided to host a webinar-style professional development seminar nationally, and it was really well attended. And most people don't know the connection between the Transcontinental Railroad and Leland Stanford. I think many people here at Stanford may not realize that connection as well, specifically Central Pacific Railroad. But in this presentation, we reviewed some of that and also engaged the teachers themselves in the analysis of some of the primary sources. So we still do conduct in-person teacher professional development seminars. That is, in fact, how I met Dr. Ornelas. We had a session on East Asia, which we continue to offer. It will be virtual this year nationally, but I missed the days in which we were able to offer these in person. So Dr. Ornelas came in from Salinas at the time. And it was amazing to talk to him, to discuss some of our shared history, right? He's of Mexican descent. I'm of Japanese descent, but there were a lot of intersections in our history. Now, despite early Chinese contributions to the US economy, tremendous contributions to people like Leland Stanford, resentment against Chinese laborers, Chinese Americans, their children who were born here, really started to grow in the 19th century, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So PBS approached us, and we decided to develop a teacher's guide that would accompany the PBS film to help teachers set the context for the film, to provide some guided viewing activities for students. You know, what do you as teachers want students to pay attention to in this video, right? And then, of course, some debriefing activities as well. So, you know, this guide is offered on the PBS website. And because of the Exclusion Act, a really interesting phenomenon arose in the Chinese community. In fact, some of my Chinese American friends traced their roots to immigration to the United States despite the Exclusion Act, because parents could call their children from China to our shores despite the Exclusion Act. And boys and girls would come. And in some cases, boys and girls who pretended to be children of the Chinese immigrants here came. They became known in our history as paper sons, paper daughters. And we also decided to capture this story in a graphic novel. This was our attempt to engage a broad audience in a visual way with this history through the lens of a paper son. And we worked with a local artist, Rich Lee, and we tried to capture this story. We worked in collaboration with the Angel Island Immigration Foundation, and we developed a graphic novel. This is pretty widely used, fortunately, in the United States, because I think it's a pretty accessible way to share this story, right? And if you ever visit, and I'm sure some of you have, the Immigration Center, you can find poetry carvings in the wall, which were discovered in the 1960s. And most of the poetry is very poignant, very sad. And we translated some of this in the graphic novel. So one of the ways to enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act was to build this immigration center on Angel Island so people couldn't escape. There were strict interrogations of the immigrants during this period. And we try to capture this in this graphic novel. And I really encourage you to visit that center, and if you're a teacher, to bring your students on a field trip. It's so powerful. Lots of immigrants from around the world stayed, including my grandmother, but she stayed for a short time on Angel Island. She's of Japanese descent. She had a sponsor here in 1910, my grandfather. So the interrogation of her wasn't as strong as that against the Chinese, because they were up against the Exclusion Act. So now, because of the Exclusion Act, in different parts of the United States, like along the West Coast, and its territories like Hawaii, labor shortages resulted. People in Hawaii, for example, went to Japan to recruit laborers. And that's why my grandfather came here. Its story is a very typical story. He was in Hiroshima, And they were having really difficult times, a lot of poverty during this time. And so he, not being the oldest son, decided to opt for a 3-year contract to work in the sugarcane fields in Hawaii. So that's why my grandfather, paternal grandfather, left Japan. Very interesting story of immigration, right? And after his stay in Hawaii, this is his passport, by the way. After his stay in Hawaii, he moved to California because he heard that wages were better and that there were more variety of crops like strawberries, which he worked in. But most of the laborers were males. And in 1909, the better looking of the two is my grandfather. One time I said that in Southeast Asia, and a teacher said, "Neither are good looking." I just remember that right now. So he's the guy who's standing. This photograph was sent to Hiroshima, their hometown, with hopes that their parents would find them brides. And I learned later through my oldest uncle that his mother liked the other guy, liked the guy sitting down, who's also a relative of mine. But she was to marry the guy standing. And I know that my grandfather couldn't read or write Japanese. So I believe that there was only a photograph exchange. My grandmother, I think, was very pretty. I don't have her photo in her kimono, which was sent to him, which he saw, and he immediately said, yeah, okay, that's oh, he probably didn't do this, but whatever they did back then. And she was a little hesitant. But at the age of 16, you could see on her passport, she decided, okay, I'll move to California. She agreed to get married. Picture bride marriage was fine by Japanese law. She had to agree to get married again, so she went to Angel Island. And then a little while later, she had to agree to get married in San Francisco City Hall. I have that document, actually. They had 11 children, 10 boys and 1 girl. Number 7 is my dad. Yeah. Of course, with the Pearl Harbor attack, things became very difficult for my family. And all of the Japanese Americans, people of Japanese descent along the West Coast. Now, at the time, if you were an Asian immigrant, you couldn't become a citizen. This changed for the Chinese in 1943. They were our allies in World War II. But not for the Japanese, like my grandpa and grandma. And it changed for them in 1952. But anyway, this is where they were forced to migrate. It's a forced migration. Initially, while they were in Salinas, they were forced to the Salinas horse tracks. There's a rodeo grounds there. So they lived there for about 3.5 months, and then they were forced to Poston, what was called War Relocation Center. Roosevelt referred to these early on as a concentration camp. Poston was one of the 10 permanent camps where my parents lived. And it was built on a Colorado River Indian tribe reservation. Interesting intersect there with native peoples, because my father and my uncles, they could see the native peoples like on horseback around their camp. It's their property, it's their land. But the US government needed their labor to help build water supply to the reservations. Now, so this is where they stayed during the war. And I'd like to say a little bit about another webinar that we gave on the Bracero program. So this was an initiative that started in 1942. And it allowed the U.S. to recruit temporary guest workers from Mexico. And these laborers, called the braceros, or Ignacio, individuals who work with their arms. So Dr. Ornelas is expertise, and I hope you'll talk about this later today. Mostly, they were heavily concentrated in our state of California. And we had a seminar with Dr. Ornelas, as you can see here. And an interesting thing here. So Japanese and Japanese Americans at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, they were extremely successful farmers. I mean, most of the strawberry crop in California. Certain vegetables, they dominated. Very profitable. My family, they were sharecroppers, not wealthy. They provided all the labor, and the landowner provided the land. And then they shared in the sale of the profit of the crop, right? I don't know what that agreement was, but that's what made them sharecroppers. So when the strawberries were turning pink, my grandparents and parents were taken away to Salinas. And then Filipino farm workers came in to harvest the crops. So the farm owner really didn't have to pay much other than the harvest of the crops, but nothing leading up to that harvest, right? So they lost a lot of labor. Be like a teacher, you work for a year, and then you're finally going to get your salary, and you're taken away. So what I want to say is the Bracero program was established because of the labor shortage. A lot of people were in the military, the draft, but also because Japanese and Japanese Americans were taken away. So who's going to harvest the crops? This is a really important point. And I think that's why, one of the big reasons why my family was taken away, And, so interesting intersect there with the Mexican community. That's how I grew up, with braceros. I wasn't born in 1942, by the way, but 54. So I worked with braceros from when I was a little boy till 64. And one of my most difficult memories was saying goodbye to the braceros when they left in 64, because they used to make me fresh tortillas. I got tired of rice and tofu from my mother. So I used to go to the Mexican braceros, and they made me tortillas and beans. It was really great. Despite, their incarceration, thousands volunteered or were drafted from the camps. Again, very common story in Japanese American history. One of my relatives, he was in the military before the war, before Pearl Harbor. After the Pearl Harbor attack, he was reclassified 4C, enemy alien. He's an American, never been to Japan. Gun was taken away. He's uprooted. He can't stay in Salinas. He ends up in Poston, and he's drafted. Because the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where there was limited internment, and Japanese Americans here fought the government to allow them to serve in the U.S. military. So they were able to serve after a while. Hachiro was one of them, my relative. He was killed in France. And his grave is still in France. Why? Well, because where would they ship his body? Well, there's no home. That's why he's buried in France. After the war, some bodies were taken up, brought back, but for some reason my family decided to leave him there. And so at this time there were segregated units. Another interesting story in our history. African American units, Japanese American units. You know, Chinese served in the Civil War. I mean, one of my relatives served in World War I, as a Japanese national, because he couldn't become a citizen, but he served in World War. So the history of Asian American Pacific Islanders serving in our wars dates back. And here's my uncle who served in Korea. Speaking about colonial period, Japanese colonized the Korean Peninsula in 1910 and 1945. Imagine my Uncle George, Japanese American, when he went there, he couldn't speak Japanese, but the Koreans could. Like, he didn't study about this, you know? And how both sides perceived each other. He's like, Mukai, why is this Japanese guy in a US uniform, right? And the Americans seeing him as in Korean in many cases. So, and so I want to mention that we also have a class, which I mentioned earlier, called the Sejong Korea Scholars Program. And, you know, I encourage you, if you're teachers or if you're parents of high school students, to encourage them to apply. I really, really hope that you do, that these courses are becoming, you know, quite popular. And then in collaboration recently, or fairly recently, with the late Secretary Norman Mineta, we developed a web-based curriculum called What Does It Mean to Be an American? It's becoming quite widely used. It's free, and you could find it on our website. And as part of this, we are asking students around the United States to write short paragraphs. Dr. Ornelas has kindly referred several of his students to us to write about what does it mean to be an American. This was partly inspired by what I was experiencing during the early part of the pandemic, like go back to China, stuff like that, and it's like really hurtful, and things that I was hearing about concerning anti-Asian hate, and really concerned about that. So we developed this curriculum called What Does It Mean to Be an American? But anyway, with that, allow me to close. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be talking today about Mexican labor, and specifically the agricultural workforce in California, a little bit of its history. Before I start, how many teachers in the room? How many educators? High school educators? No, high school educators. Okay. How many? Any English teachers in here? Oh, okay, one. But I think, you know, the story of the farm worker has been conveyed in the past in school settings, right, in K through 12, through the lens of a well-known alum here, partial alum, I suppose, attended but didn't graduate, still an alum, I think, through the work of John Steinbeck in Dubious Battle, labor issues, obviously in the Central Valley, based primarily on those labor issues, The Grapes of Wrath, which many of you are familiar with, and of Mice and Men, a story that was actually based in the Salinas Valley, where I conduct a lot of my research, right, in the Chular area, in fact, where a lot of these braceros ended up. And if you're not familiar with the Salinas Valley, well, you've probably driven through it. You know, there's anytime you get to Santa Barbara, right, you're driving through that valley, a very long valley, as Steinbeck described it. I grew up in this region, but, you know, in taking trips down to Santa Barbara or Los Angeles, you know, you drive through this valley, and of course on each side you see lettuce fields, you see broccoli fields, you see cauliflower fields, but there's never really a face to the workforce because you're so distant from the workers, right? We all eat vegetables, we all eat fruit, we drink wine, right? But historically, we've never seen the faces of the workers. Now, I'm going to throw a statistic at you for the educators. I don't know if you know this. I just found this out. 55% of students in K through 12 public schools are of Latino ancestry. Think about that for a minute. 55%. That's over 3 million students currently right now in all schools are of Latino ancestry. 78% are actually students of color. So as an educator, what I've found is that when I'm teaching students of color, specifically Latinos and specifically Mexicans, by the way, the Mexican population now numbers about over 40 million in the United States. And so what I've encountered as I work in the classrooms is teaching, whether it's ethnic studies or U.S. history, and for the educators in the room, you know very well that identity is a big issue. And it's a big issue with the ethnic studies curriculum and understanding who we are as individuals, but also to understand where we come from, our parents, our grandparents, our elders. And so for me, my research is really about that, is about empowering the students in the classroom to take pride in their communities, industries, and their workforce. I grew up in Salinas, a place where educators would tell people, Joanna, you better start doing well in math or you're going to end up in the fields like your parents, right? Those kinds of comments were very, very common. Now, a teacher probably had good intentions, right? Agricultural work is very hard labor, right? Backbreaking, we know that history. But there's also a pathway in agriculture. Of course, we know a lot of students that are actually going back to the farms, right? They're like, I'm sick of Silicon Valley, I want to go work on a farm, all right? And that's a different story. But the Salinas Valley, as Dr. Mukai mentioned, is an ethnic mosaic of the world. People don't think about it that way, right? And so through my research, I found that the Japanese Americans were pioneers in the agricultural industry in the Salinas Valley. The Tanimura family is today still the largest grower of broccoli, lettuce, cauliflower, some of these million-dollar crops, a multi-billion-dollar industry. The later years, the Tanimura family is actually interned in Salinas, believe it or not. One of the Tanimuras actually served during World War II. You also have a large population of Filipino Americans who were part of that industry, right? A lot of migrants from Oklahoma, right? We know through Steinbeck's books that were advocating for labor issues, labor rights. And of course, as Dr. Mukai mentioned, Salinas was actually one of the places where the Japanese American community across the state of California were relocated to, right, and interned. And this is part of the Rodeo there in I'm sorry, is this Poston? No, this is Salinas. Yeah, Salinas Assembly Center. Eventually moved to Poston. So I study agricultural workers, I study the bracero program, and I study the trajectory and what happened to these former braceros, okay? Now, just to kind of give you an idea of agricultural work, if you look at the chart up here, what I found was that before braceros arrived in 1941, the agricultural industry was worth about, what does that say, $32 million up there? 1940. By the time the bracero program ended in 1964, it was well over, where is it? My screen's actually kind of...
152.
64, yes. 152 million. Okay, just in a very short period. So when people talk about who saved the industry, right, from going bankrupt, these former farm workers were really responsible not only for saving the industry, but for making it the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is today. And so my research really was about finding the stories, like who were these men? I had heard about the braceros, and my grandfather, the late Guadalupe Rodriguez Fonseca, was a former bracero. And so just as Taylor mentioned, right, we learn from our elders, we hear these stories. Sometimes we believe them, sometimes we don't. Eventually I became a historian, right, as a grad student. I was like, I'm gonna actually go and investigate and find the primary sources. And that's a longer story, but eventually as I started conducting archival research, I found some incredible primary sources that are available in the Stanford Department of Special Collections. And I'll talk more about that here in a minute. But when I conducted my oral stories, my oral histories with former braceros, I found it, I mean, just incredible stories of men who saw the program, just like maybe someone joining the military would, as an opportunity to move upwardly. Many of them come from poverty, working class communities. You know, people often think that immigrants come to the country, just get this grand idea, right? But braceros were actually recruited. There were actually recruiters from the Salinas Valley, from Watsonville, from here in Santa Clara County that would actually go to Mexico to find workers, okay? Some of them actually worked in the railroad. Many of them even served later on in the military. Braceros eventually, after 1964, stay. Many of them stay. So again, that number, the over 40 million people of Mexican ancestry, many of them are connected to a former bracero. In some cases, they don't even know it, right? So I conducted a lot of oral histories with former braceros, found out that many of them actually stayed in the agriculture industry and had very successful lives in many cases. Now, there were over 2 million braceros. Not all the stories were very positive, or these remarkable stories of doing well in the industry, okay? And I'll talk about that here in a minute. But in many cases, braceros like Rafael Silva were able to bring their family, marry. There were some horror stories, like the case of Mr. Flores Barragan, who survived a terrible tragedy at Chular, where you had 32 braceros that were killed. One of the most terrible, tragic transportation accidents. And so these stories I bring into the classroom really to make a connection for students, right? This is the bracero accident that I was just mentioning. And you know, as an ethnic studies teacher or instructor, a lot of these stories are non-existent. You're not going to find them in textbooks, right? Most U.S. history courses are going to maybe like a short line about the bracero program. So part of our work in special collections in the university archives here, and part of the Ernesto Galarza collection, who was an activist that many people don't know about, that was very active in organizing farm workers before Cesar Chavez. I mean, Ernesto Galarza, also an alum, really laid the foundation for some of Cesar Chavez's successes in the late 50s and into the 60s. But a lot of people don't know about Mr. Ernesto Galarza. Mr. Galarza left incredible primary sources in the university library here, at Green Library, Special Collections. Here are some photographs from that collection about some of the work that braceros came to do in places like the Salinas Valley, in Santa Cruz, here in Santa Clara County. This is the tool that my grandfather came to work with, the short handle hoe. It was not new to the braceros. The Filipinos had used it, Japanese Americans had used it. As you can see here in this photograph from the Galarza collection, braceros, not anyone could join the bracero program. You were physically examined, inspected, went through a physical. You see recruiters here. So there's just a number of rich sources for educators to use from the collection to share with. And I use these sources in my classes. It's a very popular lesson that we developed with SPICE to demonstrate everything from immigration issues, family issues, separation issues. Historically, the topic has been focused on the men. A new generation of historians really challenged those ideas, right, about gender. And now, there's a lot more stories about the women who stayed behind. There were no women that were part of the bracero program, but that doesn't mean that women weren't, a part of it, right? A lot of these women actually stayed back, became breadwinners. And so we're finding a number of stories of the voices of women in these stories. So, for me as a researcher, I've never considered myself a gatekeeper. It was always about sharing these materials with the world. And so a few years ago, we started a very small organization called the Bracero Legacy Project, founded here through my work in special collections. And the goal, the idea was really to present these primary sources and get these photographs outside of the archive and make them accessible to the world. And so you can find a lot of these photographs through our special collections department, but also on Facebook with the Bracero Legacy Project. And part of that project is also to provide public history. As I mentioned earlier, part of my goal as an educator was really to connect these stories. So finding the stories of these former braceros and like, where are their kids today? What happened to them? What happened to their grandchildren? Where are they out today? So some of them are CHPs in the Salinas Valley. You have former bracero children and grandchildren. These are the heirs who are serving in the U.S. Congress, who are serving in the state legislature, who are entrepreneurs, who are elected officials, who are professors here at Stanford, at UC Berkeley. And a few years ago, thanks to the generosity of the SPICE program here and the Freeman Spogli Institute, we organized a beautiful event to recognize the contributions of these workers who saved the agricultural industry, right? And we invited some of the braceros that I conducted oral histories with and recognized them at a beautiful event at Encina Hall. I love this picture because the bracero there, Mr. Silva's in the middle, but I mean, I have my students stare at this picture, right? Because a lot of them sometimes don't care about elder stories, but once they start to see the young people in this picture, they start to really relate, right? Like, wait a minute, I'm that 14, 15-year-old, right? And this is a remarkable family, Mr. and Mrs. Silva, who had 7 kids. 5 of them are all college graduates, Stanford grads, physicians. And, it's a remarkable story also because this total coincidence. I mean, it's incredible that this former farm worker who came from Mexico to use the shorthandle hoe, who worked in the agricultural industry for over 40 years. His wife was also worked in a nursery. There's a young, their grandson is at this event that we organized at SPICE that day. This is in 2014. He heard the stories of these braceros. He took great pride in learning this great story. I'm not taking credit for all of this, but it just so happens that he eventually became a heavily recruited basketball player and is now a freshman here playing on the basketball team, Isa Silva. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that the legacy of braceros, their labor and their contributions are really all among us. And there's stories like them all over the state of California among these 3 million students and more. And so they're really important to make a connection to. And I think educators sometimes don't know how to make that connection. We'll talk briefly here about how to do that. And the idea really is to empower those students in your classrooms. Thank you so much for listening.
Such as Navajo, Sioux, Cherokee, etc.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we're always looking at examples of strong curriculums, right? Curricula that exist. The state of Minnesota has a pretty robust Native curriculum program through their state that is created in collaboration with their tribal nations. Something that makes Native studies and Native voice particularly difficult to include in the classroom well is that in order for it to be done right, every tribe needs to write their own. Because our tribes are not the same. We don't have the same language. We don't have the same stories. We don't have the same histories. We share some things, right? We're relatives, but we're not the same. And so we do look to other tribes, see what they're doing, see what we like, see what we think might be functional in the classroom. But each individual tribal group, tribal nation we work with has their own goals and their own perspective. And that's what makes it a little bit hard, honestly, to do this right in the K through 12 setting. If I was a teacher in Palo Alto and I wanted to teach Native history, I need to know what the tribe here wants before anything else. You can't teach a blanket Native studies that doesn't exist, right? Or it shouldn't exist because that's not real. And so if I was that teacher, I would go to the Mwekma Ohlone site. Well, first the question would be, do I know whose land I'm on? That's without land acknowledgement. I know land acknowledgement, whatever, but it's really important to take that step to first figure out where you are and then go to that tribe's website, try to find the resources that are reflective of the local indigenous communities' desires, wants, histories, goals. And a problem that we have within the community is that we have so many tribal nations. There are 111 just in the state of California. So that's 111 individual curricula that you need, and that's just the federally recognized tribes. There's plenty of non-federally recognized or state recognized tribes that are totally legitimate that are just not included in that number. And so you can start to imagine, right, that as a teacher, it can be a little bit tricky to figure out which curriculum you should start with. And it is very likely that whatever tribe is your local tribe, that they don't have a curriculum made yet because they don't have the resources yet. There's a bill that is being passed right now through the state assembly. I'm not going to say the name, or I'm not going to say the number because I forget, but it's the California Indian Education Act. And this bill is being championed by a representative, James Ramos, Native California man, and it is asking the state to provide support and funding for every individual tribe in the state of California to write its own curriculum. And so that's what's coming up the pipeline. So I know that was beyond what you asked me, but I just wanted to highlight that it gets a little tricky, right? And so as a teacher who wants to integrate the Native voice, start with where you are. Start with where you are. If you actually want to do Native studies, you have to integrate the voice of the people of the place where you are standing and where you are teaching.
I really enjoyed these. Thank you. My question is for Jeff. As somebody, I'm Indian American, I'm a community educator, and when in a lot of Indian American ethnic studies spaces, the Bracero program is used as a metaphor or used as kind of a point to look at in the history of labor-based migration, particularly in places like Silicon Valley, where we often make connections between H-1B workers in the 90s and onward and the Bracero program. I'm wondering if you could talk about opportunities to be able to tell the Bracero program where it's not only about one community, but where labor migration flows are maybe a way of framing it in so many different people see their stories rooted in Bracero history.
Yeah. I haven't seen specific lesson plans available. I know that I do that in my classroom, living and teaching in Silicon Valley. I see it every day. I see the buses, right, of people being transported from Los Gatos to Cupertino, and I see those buses. And it reminds me of the braceros in the Salinas Valley and the farm workers being transported from their homes or their neighborhoods into the corporations, right, or into the fields. Of course, it's not the same, right, but it's still a labor issue. It's still an immigration issue. And the Bracero program is still around. We call it the H-2A program. It's a visa program. They don't call it the Bracero program, but they're still bringing agricultural guest workers from places like Mexico and even Central America now. I haven't seen the lesson plans, but I do know that I personally do make a connection to the newer waves of immigrants coming. But I think part of your question was really about also South Asian American history and the agricultural industry. Did I hear that right?
Specifically, actually, I'm thinking visualizing the essential
Yes.
Indians in the U.S. technology work.
Absolutely.
All the ways that you can tell a bigger story by telling a very specific story.
Right. I do that. I mean, I'm a trained labor historian, so I've always valued that, and so I do get students to study and conduct oral histories. But just very quickly, a missing component to the ethnic studies curriculum is that South Asian American history, also of agricultural pioneers, specifically in places like Yuba City up in the north that are still there. I don't know if you know that history. That also made major contributions to this labor force. But to answer your question, I don't know of any specific lesson plans, but personally, I do make those connections.
Thank you for presenting these personal stories. This is very important for the students to relate to. I have a couple questions here. One is that California is slowly becoming a melting pot for immigrants. So how do you address kids of biracial backgrounds and of multiracial backgrounds? And then secondly, on the issue of Southeast Asian, there are a lot of Southeast Asian that really are very small in numbers, but they are present in our community. And they don't have the resources to write lesson plans. How do you address their contribution to the American fabric?
I think that's a great question for you, Dr. Mukai, because you've been working in that area with developing lesson plans.
Yes, in the area of South Asia, we have done some work on South Asians, and one of the authors I would recommend is Ronald Takaki, and he wrote a book, Strangers from a Different Shore, but specifically I remember a lecture he gave back in the day, 50 years ago, when I was a freshman, and it was called The Tide of the Turbans. A lot of references to sheiks, from that time period, and some of the resentment that they had received, like in places like where Dr. Ornelas mentioned, Central Valley, and other places. We have developed materials on South Asians, Southeast Asians, and one example I'd like to share, which I believe is connected to this question, is something we did with Cambodians. And it's a
Donut box. The donut box.
yes. Yeah. Actually, that would be a really good documentary.
It is actually on CBS
Yes.
morning show now,
Yeah.
about 2 days ago.
One of the things we did was we followed a professor from Berkeley, Kataria Cambodian, first woman to receive a PhD in the United States of Cambodian descent. And we followed her back to her ancestral home in Cambodia. My colleague did. I felt like I was part of the journey because I was very engaged with this project. But we developed 2 videos, one of her journey back to Cambodia. And it was really powerful because it was really emotional, of course, for her to visit some of the sites where certain atrocities took place. So this is called My Cambodia. It's on our website, and we developed a teacher guide for this, and it incorporates topics like genocide, heavy topics like that. And then the second film is about a Cambodian American artist on the East Coast. It's called My Cambodian America. But what you bring up is really important because we would like to do more. Historically, Stanford has had a strength in East Asia. And it's our job at SPICE to reflect, to serve as a bridge of Stanford scholarship and schools. So we've done a lot on Japan and China from some of the early years, as I mentioned. Stanford really increased its Korea studies offerings from about 20 years ago. So we do more on Korea, again, East Asia. And increasingly, Stanford's doing more on Southeast Asia, South Asia, and I want to do more at SPICE. We have done quite a few things as part of thematic units, like homelands and diasporas, right? Immigration, right? And one of the reasons why we're limited is that it's really hard for me to raise money sometimes for certain topics. You know, where would I raise funding for a topic like on Hmong? I would like to do more. And and it's on me. I haven't been successful in raising more money to do things. But sometimes what will happen is like a filmmaker will come to me and say, "Hey Gary, we have this new film. Can you develop a guide for it?" So then the costs are relatively low. You know, we don't have to develop a film. But we would like to do more. And one of the things that, you know, we've been trying to promote is this idea of the U.S. as more like a salad bowl, kind of, instead of a melting pot, where we feel that people really need to retain their unique identities, whether or not they're multiracial, biracial, or, you know, we're doing work in Hawaii right now. And it's not because I want to go to Hawaii all the time. But, I mean, talk about like a diverse society with, I mean, such an incredibly rich salad bowl type environment concerning people from all over the world, Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, you know, and it's just really fascinating for me. So one thing we're trying to do there is, again, I'm trying to raise money to develop a course for students in Hawaii that focuses on topics like identity. I worked once with a filmmaker who is African American, and he developed a film called Doubles. So he prefers the term double instead of biracial. Double identity, right? And so we have explored this notion as well. But thank you for that question. I think what you're doing at 1990 Project is terrific. Linking the homeland, you know, and the diaspora, Chinese in the diaspora, right? So.
And then we're doing AAPI stuff for ethnic studies. We're creating
Yeah.
videos to support it.
Yeah. I hope people will learn about 1990 Project, yeah.
Thank you so much to everyone that's here. This concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for your time.